Inflation has skyrocketed to 4.1% in August, and that leads us down a whole bunch of different rabbit holes of conversations. Primarily, is inflation actually transitory? How is it going to affect the election, primarily for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau? And what could happen that would cause inflation to turn out to not to be transitory, but to be something that we're going to have to deal with for the long term? And I'm going to discuss all of those things today, but before we do, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell. Please hit that like button so more people like you can see this video, and don't forget about our race to 25,000 subscribers, where one lucky winner is going to win $5,000 to put towards their savings, their investments, maybe pay down their mortgage, use it for down payment, or maybe, as we suggested in the last video, to get rid of their car loan. But one thing is for certain, in order to win, you have to be subscribed. So go ahead, click that subscribe button. It's free, it's easy, it's definitely worth it. The definitive guide on how to manage your credit. Product, penalty, price, in that order. It's never been more important to get your mortgage right. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's discuss everyone's favorite topic right now, and that is inflation. Primarily, that hit has gone to 4.1%, which is the highest it's been in about a decade or two. And it's a really high number, but what is actually going on here? Is it transitory? Is it something that we need to worry about? Is it going to come back down? Does it mean higher rates? What does it mean for Justin Trudeau? All of the things, that's what we're talking about today. And there's one little topic at the end I'm going to talk about that could lead this inflation to last longer. And it's what you need to be aware of and what you need to be watching when it comes time to look at inflation and what you should be doing with your mortgages. So let's jump into it here, as we always do, and pull up our first and foremost favorite news source, BNN Bloomberg, who has the headline, inflation jumps to 4.1% in Canada, which is a headline on its own, but then they tag on the jolting Trudeau's election bid onto the second part of that headline. And this is why it might affect Trudeau's election bid, and that is primarily because the biggest issue in the economy right now and the biggest political issue is affordability, not just with housing, but affordability in general. And if inflation is high, it could go to show or could insinuate that the federal government's policies with respect to COVID have had a negative effect on the economy by creating high inflation and creating a higher cost of living. And this is a typical argument that conservatives make about liberal type policies. It's when you spend, it injects too much into the economy, you create inflation, and therefore an overall higher cost for everybody, including higher taxes and so on and so forth. Now, the key piece of the conversation around inflation, though, isn't to do with the election. It's to do with whether or not this is transitory, whether it has to do with supply side issues that are creating lower amounts of supply along with higher demand that's increasing prices up, or if it's one or two pieces of the economy that are having a greater effect on the overall CPI. And if we go ahead and we take a look at the inflation that's happening around the world, what we can see is that the US right now has the highest level of inflation. And that is primarily to do with the way that they handled the pandemic, primarily with injecting cash directly to consumers. This is different than what happened in 2008, where it was largely sent to businesses. During the pandemic in 2020, a lot of money was put right in the hands of consumers, causing higher inflation. And then combined with supply side issues, that is what's created even higher numbers in the CPI index. But what you'll note here is that while US has the highest numbers and Canada has the second highest numbers, if you take a look right here, all of these inflation numbers in the next year or two are forecast to come back down into normal levels. That includes the really low inflation rates that existed in Japan. And it also includes the higher rates in places like the Euro area, the UK, and Canada and the US. So everywhere across the country, economists in general have a consensus that inflation is going to come back down. And this inflation that we're seeing right now is going to be largely transitory. And that'll start to happen around the end of 2022, which is when we expect interest rates to rise. Now, if we go ahead and we take a look at the actual Bank of Canada data, the key inflation indicators and the target rate, I want to show you this here real fast because this has four different measures of inflation on it. This is a chart that basically shows the total CPI, CPI trim, CPI median, and CPI common. And what are those things? Okay, so first of all, total CPI is the total cost of the goods, all the goods in the basket, and that measures everything in the economy that is in that CPI basket, and that gives you typically a number that fluctuates quite quite significantly. And when central banks look at economics and they look at inflation, they tend to look more at core inflation numbers rather than total CPI. So they look at things like CPI trim, CPI median, and CPI common. So what is CPI trim, median, and common? Well, CPI trim basically takes the 20% of goods that have gone up significantly and the 20% that have gone down, takes them out of the equation and just looks at the band of goods that are in the middle. The reason for that is it takes away any big spikes or any big drops in certain aspects of the economy or certain types of goods and basically gets rid of them so that you can see a normal picture of what's going on instead of having these 2 or 3 goods that might throw the CPI off quite substantially. And things that can throw it off quite substantially are things like energy prices, things like housing prices, and things like food in a lot of cases have major variations because of things like growing conditions or transportation issues and so on and so forth. So the CPI trim takes the bottom 20% and the top 20% out. Now CPI median, it takes the middle good, the good that falls in the middle of all the CPI basket goods, and it looks at what that good is doing. So the thing that has the most consistent price over time that's following in the middle, and it tends to be a more flatter line. So if you go ahead and you take a look at this flatter line here, what you see is that CPI median tends to kind of float in the center. Now, if you go ahead and you take a look at the CPI common, what the CPI common does is they have a factor that they use to take out variability in the market. And what you see is that CPI common ends up being very flat over time as well. And what we're looking for is typically we want to see these numbers be very close together. And most of the time in a normal operating economy, this is 2019 right here. This is leading up to 2010. What you'll see is all those numbers kind of travel together. But when we have big price variations in different areas of the economy, like back in the 90s with oil and gas here, and today specifically with gas and housing prices, and even in 2018 here, well, then what happens is we end up with these numbers that are really skewed for total CPI, and it doesn't really give the best picture of what's actually going on. So that's why central banks tend to use the CPI core numbers, which are those 3 other numbers, rather than total CPI to forecast what's going on in the economy. And if you take a look at them right now, yes, they're going up, but they're deviating quite substantially, which means that there are certain goods in the economy that are going up significantly in price, that more than what the rest of the goods are. And there's certain goods that are staying pretty typical to what they should be. And therefore, that typically means that we have transitory inflation. Now, if we go ahead and we take a look here and we jump into the Stats Canada Consumer Price Index release that was released this morning, you can see that the consumer price index, as we have mentioned previously here, has gone up by 4.1%. That's up from 3.7% in July. But if you take gasoline out, just gasoline out, then CPI only rose by 3.2%. So one of the biggest contributors to inflation right now is the price of gasoline. And the reason the price of gasoline has gone up by 35% is because last year it went down significantly, and that single good definitely has transitory inflation. It definitely has a higher price than, at least from an inflation perspective, than it should, because of how much difference there is between last year and this year, even though the prices of gas compared to 2019 aren't significantly different than they were pre-pandemic. So you take that out, inflation is actually 3.2%, and therefore it leads the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve Bank to at least be able to acknowledge that if we just take gasoline out, and we know that gasoline's probably going to come back to a normal price and more normal levels, well, that leads us to normal inflation. Now, here's the big risk. Here's the thing that could come back to haunt everyone, and that is sky-high job vacancies. This is from RBC Economics. They have a report with respect to job vacancies. This, not to be confused with unemployment, because unemployment numbers are still quite high. But if you go and take a look at job vacancies, this is the unfilled jobs. So this is the jobs that employers have. They're trying to find people to fill them, and they can't find somebody to take the job. And here's the problem with this. In order to attract employees, they have to raise wages. And if they raise wages, that leads to greater demand in the economy, which leads to the ability for prices to go up and ultimately could mean that the transitory inflation becomes real inflation somewhere down the road. So this is the number, and this is the thing that we need to keep an eye on, is the actual numbers with respect to job vacancies and jobs actually getting filled. Because if wages start to rise, that means that we are going to see bigger numbers with respect to inflation down the road because people are going to have more money to spend, and ultimately prices could end up going up across the board. Now, if those job vacancies get filled and we end up with more people working without higher wages, that means that pretty much there's going to be less money in the economy to buy goods at more expensive rates, and therefore we should have less inflation going forward. Now, if I had to make a bet right now, and I may be wrong somewhere down the road, but I would bet that we are still going to continue to see low interest rates and low inflation for a very, very, very long time to come. I think coming into 2022, we could start to see negative inflation, primarily because we're going to have high numbers for this year with not a lot of growth in the economy, and therefore a trend towards lower prices as businesses try to mark down their prices in order to sell more, especially as supply bottlenecks start to come undone and we start to see more supply available to consumers. That is just my take, but for me, if I'm a betting man, and I am, especially when it comes to mortgages, I would suggest that people take variable rate mortgages. One, because they don't have to pay a premium for the rates. Two is because if interest rates do start to go up, they can start to lock in and still take advantage of lower rates for now, locking in some savings until we know that interest rates are actually going to go up. We've got at least a year until that is going to happen. And three, it's because we know that with fixed rate mortgages, we have that little thing called a penalty, which is the single most expensive factor in a mortgage, because most people don't realize that they're probably going to have to pay that penalty at some point, even though they don't think they will. It's always the one, always the couple, always the people who think that they're never going to have a penalty that end up calling crying 3 years later because they have a $25,000 or $30,000 penalty with their big bank, which is why we always suggest that you want right now, especially, not only the lowest price mortgage, but the mortgage with the most flexibility, especially if there's something that happens in the economy that could lead you to have to sell your house or have to rejig your finances. So if you found this video useful, do me that favor, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell. Please hit that like button so more people like you can see this video. Don't forget about a race to 25,000 subscribers, and we'll see you on the very next one. Cheers.